A 13-year-old girl boarded a plane with a valid first-class ticket, and less than 10 minutes later, she was humiliated, moved like baggage, and told she didn't belong, all because of how she looked. But what no one knew was who she was texting, and that her quiet message would shake the entire airline industry to its core. This is not just a story about a seat on a plane. It's about a moment, one that forced the skies to reckon with injustice happening right at 30,000 feet. Stay with us, because what happens next isn't just shocking, it's history in the making. One girl. One message. And a flight that would never be the same again. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories that reveal the truth, challenge prejudice, and inspire change. Because the next seat someone tries to take might be yours. In Seat 2A of Flight 719 bound for New York City, a young girl sat quietly, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her breathing slow and steady like someone trying not to disturb the air around her. Her name was Isla Morgan, a 13-year-old African-American girl from Oakland, California. Her hair was pulled back into a low ponytail, and she wore a soft navy hoodie over a collared shirt, something casual, but respectful. At her feet was a canvas backpack, faded from years of use. It carried stickers from science camps, public library cards, and a name tag that was half peeling. It wasn't just a backpack. It was part of her. It had been with her through every presentation, every scholarship exam, every late-night bus ride home from school when her mom worked the night shift. This was Isla's first time flying alone, and not just anywhere. This was first class. Outside the window, the early spring sunlight streamed in across the runway at San Francisco International Airport. The world outside was bright, busy, full of movement and noise. But inside that seat, Isla found a strange kind of calm. Like the kind of stillness before the overture of something bigger. She wasn't scared. Just full. Full of thoughts. Full of that strange mix of pride and vulnerability that only comes when you're finally stepping into something you've worked your whole life for. The ticket tucked into her hoodie pocket had her name on it in bold, black print, Isla Morgan, Seat 2A, First Class. It had been gifted to her by Dr. Alina Jennings, her mentor and godmother. Alina wasn't related by blood, but she'd been family ever since Isla was 8 and had stayed late after science club one day because no one had come to pick her up. Alina was the one who gave her her first microscope. Who told her she was brilliant when no one else did. Who showed her that black girl and scientist belonged in the same sentence. This ticket wasn't just a boarding pass. It was a message: you belong in every room you walk into. Including this one. Isla had spent the past 3 weeks attending a prestigious youth climate and technology summit in San Francisco, an opportunity she had earned after writing an essay that outscored submissions from over 300 students nationwide. For her, flying back in first class wasn't about luxury. It was about dignity. She wasn't looking for compliments or attention. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was just sitting in her assigned seat, listening to the muffled announcements through her earbuds, her fingers idly flipping through a weathered copy of Silent Spring. She had read it a dozen times already, but it always felt like new. Science did that to her. It made the world feel larger, but not out of reach. As the boarding process continued, more and more people began to fill the cabin. Expensive shoes, designer coats, briefcases that probably cost more than her laptop. Isla didn't mind. She didn't feel intimidated. If anything, she was excited to see what it felt like to sit among people who, for once, wouldn't question whether she belonged. But that belief was about to be tested in a way she couldn't have imagined. As she sat, quietly soaking in the atmosphere, the scent of citrus hand lotion and leather upholstery in the air, Isla didn't know that somewhere down the jet bridge, a storm was heading her way. She didn't know about the woman briskly walking toward the aircraft, clipboard in hand, her red lipstick sharp against her pale skin, her name badge gleaming under the terminal lights, Carolyn Whitmore, senior flight attendant of Transair for over 17 years. To most, Carolyn was the embodiment of professionalism, her uniform always pressed, her tone always polite, her posture precise. But what most didn't see was the mechanism behind the polish, a mental algorithm that categorized passengers the moment she laid eyes on them. She didn't just read boarding passes. She read clothes, posture, skin tone, accents. And when she stepped onto that plane, when her eyes scanned over Isla Morgan's hoodie, scuffed sneakers, and soft brown face, she paused. Just for a moment. A flicker. The smile faltered. The mental file she had been conditioned to build, day in and day out, clicked open in her mind. That's not a first-class passenger. No words had been spoken yet. No rules were broken. Just a glance. But in that glance, the seat beneath Isla might as well have evaporated. Back in seat 2A, Isla hadn't noticed. She was highlighting a passage in her book. Her earbuds buzzed faintly with an instrumental playlist. But she did hear the heels. Sharp clicks on the carpet. Getting closer. Then came the voice. "Excuse me." Isla looked up. Carolyn was standing over her, arms crossed tightly over her navy jacket, chin slightly raised. "You're in the wrong seat," she said. Not asked, said. The tone was practiced. Polite enough to pass muster. Cold enough to cut. Isla blinked. "I'm sorry." "I said you're in the wrong seat," Carolyn repeated, this time a bit louder. A few heads in nearby rows turned subtly. Isla's stomach sank. "I think this is my seat." 2A, Isla said quietly, reaching into her hoodie pocket. Carolyn didn't wait for the ticket. Her eyes scanned Isla again from the worn backpack at her feet to the sticker on her water bottle. "This is the first-class cabin," she added, as if it weren't obvious. "I know," Isla replied, gently unfolding the ticket. She handed it up, both hands steady. Carolyn took one glance. Not even a full second. Then, without hesitation, she gave a tight-lipped smile and said, "Why don't we have you move to the back? We'll figure things out there." Isla blinked. "But it'll just be easier," Carolyn cut in. No further explanation. No offer to double-check. Just a command. And just like that, the seat Isla had looked forward to for weeks, the one her godmother had proudly booked, the one her effort had earned, was gone. The cabin was still silent. No one said anything. A man across the aisle lowered his newspaper slightly, then raised it again. A woman in heels fiddled with her phone. Nothing more. Isla's throat tightened, but she didn't argue. She didn't plead. Somewhere deep inside, she knew if she protested, she'd be labeled the problem. Loud. Aggressive. Difficult. Instead, she stood. Quietly. She picked up her bag. She kept her head down. Not out of shame, but because she had to. Every step down that aisle felt like a mile. Her sneakers squeaked against the carpet. Her heartbeat was louder than any engine. And still no one stopped her. No one asked why a teenage girl with a first-class ticket was being escorted out without verification. No one cared. She made her way toward the economy section. Toward a seat that didn't have her name on it. But as she walked, she reached for her phone. And in the space of one breath, one thought, one decision, she sent a message. Just one. And that, dear listener, is where the flight changed course. The seat by the window in row 22 wasn't assigned to Isla Morgan, but that's where she sat now. She had been removed politely, publicly, and without question from her rightful place in first class. Her body was still. Her posture upright. Her eyes, however, were frozen on the window, not because of the view outside, but because she couldn't stand to look at anything else. Not the other passengers. Not the silent ones who turned away. Not the empty seat beside her. Everything felt wrong. Her backpack was at her feet. The same one that had seen science fairs, museum trips, and library nights. But now, it sat there like a symbol of being misplaced, repositioned, like her. She wasn't supposed to be here. Her palms were clenched. Her heart beat like a drum muffled behind walls of silence. Isla didn't cry. She didn't shake. But there was something inside her that did move, a quiet decision. She reached for her phone. Not to complain. Not to vent. But to speak to the only person who would truly see her. She opened her messages. Tapped on a contact simply labeled, Dr. J. And she typed, "She made me leave my seat. Said I don't belong there. I'm in the back now." She stared at the message for a moment. Then pressed send. A simple action. A single tap. And just like that, the silence cracked. Miles away in Washington, D.C., Dr. Alina Jennings, Director of Aviation Oversight at the National Transportation Safety Bureau, NTSB, was finishing a video conference. The walls of her office were lined with certificates and framed newspaper articles, but her attention was pulled sharply toward the blinking notification on her screen. She didn't smile. She didn't hesitate. She stood. Alina walked to the tall windows overlooking the Capitol skyline. Her eyes didn't see the view. They were somewhere else, back in San Francisco, back on Flight 719, back with a girl who had just been forced out of a seat she'd earned. Without needing more, Alina picked up the secure line on her desk and spoke, her voice low and steady, "This is Director Jennings. I'm requesting an emergency hold on Transair Flight 719, scheduled from San Francisco Airport to JFK. Immediate compliance." On the other end of the line, a dispatcher's voice cracked with uncertainty. "Director, what's the reason?" "Priority federal violation," Alina replied. "A minor passenger ticketed in first class was removed without verification. This requires immediate coordination. Ground all movement. Now." The line went quiet for half a second. Then, "Understood. Executing now." Click. Back on the tarmac at San Francisco International, the cabin of Flight 719 was beginning to settle. A flight attendant closed the overhead bin. Another helped a man with his tablet. The pilot had just completed the safety check when the dashboard monitor flashed. A red light. A message from Central Dispatch, Flight 719, hold position. Do not taxi. Captain Elliot Graves frowned. He tapped the screen. Another line followed, FAA intervention requested. Internal incident pending. Stand by. Elliot leaned back slowly in his seat, removed his headset, and turned to his co-pilot. "We're not going anywhere." In the galley near the front, Carolyn Whitmore sipped a paper cup of sparkling water, adjusting her scarf. Her voice earlier, crisp and commanding, had quieted. But the energy around her began to shift. One of the junior flight attendants, Ben, approached hesitantly. Carolyn. Captain just got an FAA-level hold. We're not moving yet." Carolyn's brows furrowed. "Mechanical?" "No. FAA flagged something about passenger procedures." Her grip on the cup tightened. A drop of condensation slid down her wrist. She didn't say anything. But she knew. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she already knew. Row 22. Isla sat still. She didn't know why the plane had stopped. No announcement yet. No change in the air pressure. But her phone buzzed again. Dr. J had replied. What happened? No emojis. No fluff. Just 2 words. And yet they pierced through the fog of the moment like sunlight through mist. It wasn't just a question. It was an affirmation. Someone was listening. She typed back, slower this time, "The flight attendant didn't believe my ticket was real." She looked at it for half a second, didn't even check the list. "She just told me I had to move. No one said anything. I didn't want to make a scene. So I moved." Send. Isla set her phone down. Her hands curled into fists again, but this time, they weren't shaking. Something was building. A pressure. But it wasn't fear. It was strength. The cabin PA system buzzed. Captain Graves' voice came through, firm and composed. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've been requested to hold at the gate for a few moments due to a procedural review. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Thank you for your patience. Row 2. Empty. Row 22. Quiet." Isla heard the message. She didn't look up. But her chest rose slightly. Her fingers relaxed, just a little. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. But deep inside, she knew, something has changed. At the NTSB offices, Alina Jennings sent one final message: an official notice to the airline. Passenger Isla Morgan, age 16, was improperly removed from her assigned seat. Full compliance review initiated. Return passenger to original seat. Immediate correction required. And then, without pause, she called the FAA. Minutes later, Captain Graves received the final instruction: have the head flight attendant come to the cockpit. The cockpit door opened with a soft knock. Carolyn stepped inside, smiling nervously. "Everything all right, Captain?" He didn't return the smile. He pointed to the spare headset. "You're going to want to put this on." Carolyn hesitated. Then slipped it on. The voice on the other end was icy calm. "This is Commander Weiss, Federal Aviation Authority. You are speaking on behalf of a direct report from Director Alina Jennings." Carolyn's mouth opened slightly, but she couldn't speak. The voice continued: "You are being asked, per federal order, to return minor passenger Isla Morgan to her originally ticketed seat in first class. You will do this personally, publicly, and you will issue a formal apology. Understood?" She swallowed hard. I didn't mean. This is not about what you meant. Did you verify her ticket with the ground staff?" Silence. "Did you consult the passenger list?" Still silence. "You acted on visual assessment alone?" A small, trembling voice. "Yes." "Then you violated 3 procedural standards. You will now correct them." The door opened again. Carolyn stepped into the aisle, her smile forced but cracking at the edges. The cabin had grown quiet. Tense. People looked up. She walked slowly past the rows of indifferent passengers, past the curtain that separated privilege from presumption. She stopped at row 22. Isla turned to look at her. Carolyn's voice was low, brittle. "There's been a misunderstanding. Please return to your original seat." Isla didn't move. She didn't shout. She just asked, simply, "Why didn't you check?" Carolyn blinked. "You looked at me, and you decided." "Why?" No one spoke. A nearby passenger shifted. Another lowered their phone. Carolyn whispered, "I made a mistake." Isla stood. She said nothing more. But as she walked back toward row 2, the first-class cabin was silent, not the silence of indifference this time, but of recognition. The kind that comes when people finally realize they should have spoken up, but didn't. Isla didn't say a word as she walked past the curtain. She didn't need to. The silence in the cabin spoke louder than anything she could have screamed. Her small shoulders, once hunched in disbelief, were now drawn back with quiet composure. No triumph, no vengeance. Just stillness. The kind of stillness that unnerved. That exposed. Every step down the aisle felt heavier now, not for Isla, but for the people watching her return. The woman with the pearl earrings suddenly found something in her purse to look for. The man in the gray suit by 2C stared intently at his tray table, as if decoding secrets in its plastic grain. No one looked directly at her, but everyone saw her. She reached seat 2A, her seat, the one that had waited untouched, unoccupied, exactly as she had left it. Like the truth. waiting for someone to claim it. She sat down. Her backpack returned to its rightful place by her feet. Her book lay untouched on the tray. She didn't need to open it. In that moment, Isla wasn't reading a story. She was the story. In the galley, Carolyn stood stiff as metal, hands folded in front of her, the tight knot in her chest pulling at every breath she took. Her years of experience, her countless flights, the praise, the performance, it all felt paper-thin now. And it wasn't the captain's cold tone or the FAA's quiet wrath that shook her. It was the girl's question. So calm, so sharp. Why didn't you check? A question she had no clean answer for. A question that cut past policy and poked at something deeper. Something she hadn't wanted to name. Something she had wrapped in professionalism, buried under routine. She had looked at Isla Morgan and made a decision. Not based on a ticket. Not based on facts. But based on a feeling. An assumption. The captain's voice returned over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our taxi shortly. Thank you for your patience. The tone was level, unbothered. But everyone in that cabin knew something unusual had just occurred. Something that had rearranged the air between them. Seatbelts clicked into place, but no one dared to return fully to the pretense of normal. The quiet wasn't passive anymore. It was heavy. Almost questioning. Some passengers stole glances at Isla, just long enough to register what had happened, but not long enough to carry the weight of it. In seat 2C, the man in the gray suit leaned toward the woman beside him and whispered, "We've been silent in the wrong way." The woman didn't reply, but the way her jaw tensed, the way her eyes flicked toward Isla and then away, it said enough. In seat 2A, Isla remained still. She didn't nod, didn't react. She just breathed. And for the first time since she had boarded the flight, the air felt like hers again. Somewhere in the rear galley, a message lit up on the crew's device: FAA representatives will meet Flight 719 upon arrival. Prepare crew reports. Flag incident. No flashing red lights, no loud alarms. Just protocol. Quiet, cold, and final. Carolyn saw it. Her throat tightened again. She couldn't move. She couldn't even pretend to be unaffected anymore. In her peripheral vision, she saw the passengers exchanging whispers. Not angry. Not loud. Just low enough to sting. The cabin wasn't hers anymore. It was a courtroom. And the verdict was already echoing in their silence. The junior attendant, Ben, stood nearby, his clipboard clutched to his chest, his face pale. He looked at Carolyn, his voice barely a whisper, "They're going to ask why you only checked one ticket." Carolyn didn't answer. She couldn't. Not because she didn't know. But because the answer wasn't just unprofessional, it was unforgivable. And yet, Isla never once turned around. She didn't glare. Didn't stare. Didn't demand. That, more than anything, unsettled Carolyn. If Isla had cried, if she had screamed or called her a name, maybe she could have justified it to herself. Maybe she could have said the girl was unreasonable, dramatic. But Isla hadn't done any of that. She had done nothing, except exist. Sit. Be visible. And somehow, that alone had been too much. As the plane finally began taxiing, the engines humming low beneath the floor, Isla looked out the window, not at the ground speeding past, not at the sky waiting ahead, but at her own reflection faint in the glass. And for the first time since she had taken that seat, she allowed herself to feel what had happened. Not with tears. But with acknowledgement. This had happened. To her. Because someone had decided, without a word, that she didn't belong. And yet here she was. Still in her seat. Still here. The plane had leveled out somewhere above Nevada when the cabin lights dimmed into their gentle cruising glow. Meal service began. Trays clinked, plastic utensils unwrapped, and the sound of soda cans opening whispered across the first-class cabin like a return to normalcy. But normal had long since left Flight 719. And everyone knew it. Carolyn moved methodically down the aisle, offering beverages, adjusting tray tables, her smile mechanical, movements rehearsed. Yet no matter how straight her posture or precise her tone, something felt wrong. Off. Like she had stepped out of sync with the rhythm of the flight. Passengers responded with forced politeness, their smiles polite but thin, their eyes shifting quickly elsewhere when she looked their way. It wasn't open hostility. It was something far colder, withdrawal. And still, Isla didn't say a word. She sat in seat 2A, hands on her lap, the same science book untouched on her tray. She hadn't touched the water she'd been offered. She hadn't unwrapped her snack. Her gaze remained steady on the clouds beyond the window. But Carolyn could feel it every time she passed by that row, the tension coiled tighter. It wasn't the girl's silence that haunted her. It was what that silence reflected. It mirrored everything Carolyn didn't want to see in herself. Somewhere behind the cabin doors, the flight continued like any other. But inside, two timelines had diverged, the flight before Isla's removal, and the one after her return. And they would never fully converge again. In the cockpit, Captain Graves received the latest message: FAA agent and legal representative will board at arrival gate. Immediate debrief required. He read the words without emotion. But deep inside, he understood the gravity. A mid-air FAA intervention wasn't routine. It wasn't a delay or maintenance hold. This was systemic. This was personal. Back in row 4, the man in the gray suit who had earlier whispered about being silent in the wrong way, tapped a message into his phone and stared at it for a long time before deleting it. He glanced at Isla, then looked away, guilt rising like static under his skin. He'd seen what had happened. He'd known it was wrong. But he'd sat still. And now that stillness echoed louder than any protest ever could. Meanwhile, in a glass-walled office far from the clouds, Dr. Alina Jennings stood at a whiteboard, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, a stack of documents untouched on her desk. She wasn't in her director's jacket. She wasn't in a press conference or a courtroom. But her presence filled the room like thunder. On her laptop screen, a secure live feed flickered with data from Flight 719. Coordinates, altitude, gate status all irrelevant. What mattered now was not where the plane was, but what it carried: a failure. A breach. And a message from a girl who never raised her voice but shook the entire system. Her assistant entered the room quietly, a printed memo in hand. Alina read it once, then again. At the bottom of the page, a short sentence printed in bold: minor passenger removed from seat 2A without verification. Incident escalated. Legal inspection requested. She didn't flinch. She simply nodded. Prepare a compliance directive. Effective immediately. I want protocol reform by Monday. Include a name for the directive, the assistant asked. Alina looked up. Yes. Call it the Morgan Clause. 37,000 feet below, the tarmac at JFK was already under preparation. Two agents from the FAA, one in a tailored gray suit, the other in a navy blue uniform with silver insignia on the shoulders, stood near gate 47 with silence as sharp as steel. Their presence alone redirected movement around them. Staff whispered. Phones buzzed. A delay like this wasn't just a delay anymore. It was a warning. As Flight 719 began its descent, a subtle shift rippled through the cabin. Passengers started straightening up, stowing their items, adjusting their jackets, but their movements were more reserved than usual. No casual laughter. No idle chatting. The collective awareness had settled in. Isla finally looked down. Her hands were still. She placed the science book back into her backpack, zipped it carefully, and placed it upright by her feet. She didn't look around. But she felt it: the change. Not just in the air pressure, but in the room itself. And when the wheels touched down, there was no applause. Just silence. Not out of fear, but reverence. As the plane taxied toward the gate, the final announcement came from the captain: "Please remain seated. We have a team from the FAA meeting the aircraft upon arrival. This is a standard procedure. Thank you for your cooperation." But everyone knew it wasn't standard. The jet bridge extended. The cabin door opened with a soft mechanical sigh. And then, they appeared. The woman in the blue suit, nameplate glinting under the fluorescent lights, Officer Rowan. She was calm, composed, unreadable. Beside her, a man with a federal badge and a case file marked, "Immediate Compliance Review." They stepped into first class and did not smile. They didn't need to. "Where is Head Attendant Carolyn Whitmore?" Rowan asked. Every passenger turned. Carolyn, standing by the galley wall, stiffened. Her throat dry, her heart pounding against her ribcage like a metronome gone wild. She took one step forward. "I'm here." The man in the gray suit nodded once. "You'll come with us for questioning." No further words. No handcuffs. No resistance. But no one mistook it for anything less than serious. As Carolyn walked past Isla, her eyes faltered. For a brief moment, their gazes met, one filled with calm clarity, the other with unraveling regret. Isla didn't blink. Carolyn did. Then she was gone, led out of the cabin, down the jet bridge, and into a hallway where uniforms and policies would no longer protect her. In seat 2A, Isla looked out the window one last time. Not to see who was watching her, but to remind herself she had never needed permission to be here. And now, the world knew it too. The door closed. A soft mechanical hiss, followed by a final, decisive click. The kind of sound that usually goes unnoticed at the end of every flight. But not this time. This time, the entire first-class cabin felt it like a sentence. Carolyn Whitmore was gone. Escorted, not dragged. No drama. No shouting. But everyone knew what it meant. Her absence weighed more than her presence ever did. The silence that remained behind didn't loosen, it tightened. Passengers didn't look at one another. Not directly. But the tension curled around every movement. A man adjusted his watch 3 times in a row. A woman pulled her scarf a little higher around her neck, suddenly conscious of her pearls. The air was still recirculating, still filtered, still pressurized. But it no longer felt clean. It felt complicit. Isla sat motionless in seat 2A, her backpack upright at her feet, her palms resting gently on her knees. She wasn't looking around. She didn't need to. She could feel everything. Every glance flickered her way, then quickly away. Every cough was swallowed. Every sigh, stifled. The girl they had watched be removed was now sitting in the same seat without apology, without commentary. And that stillness, that unshakable calm, had become the loudest presence in the cabin. She didn't look angry. She didn't look proud. She simply looked like she belonged. And that was enough to make some of them shift in their seats. A young man from row 2C leaned slightly to the side, not enough to be noticed directly, but just enough to catch Isla's profile. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Regret stuck in his throat like gravel. Finally, in a voice barely louder than the hum of the engines, he said, "We should have said something." The woman next to him placed a hand over his fingers. She didn't answer. But her grip said she agreed. It also said, "We didn't." Farther back, the economy cabin began to stir. People standing, overhead bins opening, the usual rustle of landing procedures. But in first class, no one rushed to disembark. No one stood. They waited, unconsciously perhaps, to see what the girl would do. Isla didn't move. Not until the final announcement came, "Passenger Isla Morgan, please disembark." FAA escort waiting at the gate. Her name, spoken over the intercom, was not a summons, it was a recognition. A confirmation that the system knew exactly who she was now. Isla stood, not slowly, not dramatically, but with the same measured poise that had carried her through the last few hours like an invisible shield. She lifted her backpack onto one shoulder. She didn't glance back. She didn't pause. But as she turned toward the aisle, her step steady, her shoulders square, a quiet shift rippled through the cabin. A woman near the front nodded, ever so slightly. A man near the back lowered his eyes, ashamed. Nobody applauded. Nobody cheered. But as Isla walked down that narrow aisle, the same one she had walked earlier in humiliation this time, no one dared look away. She stepped onto the jet bridge and into the bright, sterile light of the terminal. Waiting for her was not a crowd, not a line of reporters, but one woman. Dark blue coat. Hair pinned back. A badge clipped discreetly at her waist. Dr. Alina Jennings. She didn't speak right away. She didn't need to. She looked at Isla the way a lighthouse looks at the ocean, not for attention, but to guide something home. When she did speak, her voice was soft but certain. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" Isla nodded. "I don't need them to say I was right," she said quietly. "I just need them to think twice next time." Alina smiled, placed a hand on Isla's shoulder, and together, they turned. Their footsteps were quiet, but the weight behind them, centuries of silence, of assumption, of removal, was loud. They disappeared into the terminal, leaving behind a cabin full of people who, for the first time, were left to sit with their own silence. Not the silence of calm, but the silence of accountability. Somewhere high above the Atlantic, another flight was cruising through a different sky. Businessmen tapped away on tablets, a child cried softly in coach, a flight attendant reheated dinner trays behind a velvet curtain. Routine. Predictable. But across the American aviation system, nothing felt routine anymore. Because thousands of feet below, in a boardroom wrapped in floor-to-ceiling windows and overlooking the runways at Atlantic Terminal, silence had also landed. The memo had arrived less than an hour after Flight 719 touched down. Slipped into the inboxes of every senior executive at Transair Airlines. No warning. No explanation. Just a subject line, FAA notice, passenger compliance violation, immediate action required. Inside, the language was clinical. Measured. But there was no mistaking the blow behind every word. It stated plainly that a minor passenger had been forcibly removed from her assigned first-class seat without proper verification. That standard operating procedures had been bypassed. That the act was discriminatory. That it had triggered a federal investigation. At the bottom of the memo, bolded and underlined, the passenger in question is Isla Morgan, 16. FAA Oversight Director Dr. Alina Jennings has requested full transparency and systemic review. Priority level, critical. In the sterile silence of the executive boardroom, no one moved. Not the CEO, whose knuckles whitened on the arms of his chair. Not the legal director, who flipped the page twice, as if hoping something had changed. Not the director of flight operations, whose lips pressed into a hard, breathless line. They had dealt with complaints before. Angry customers, videos gone viral, even lawsuit threats. But this was different. Because this wasn't just about one girl in one seat. It was about what the seat represented. And who had been told without words, without violence, that they didn't belong. Across the room, the head of human resources cleared her throat. Her voice was crisp, cutting through the quiet like a blade. The FAA has issued 3 new compliance orders, she said, sliding a packet across the table. Effective immediately. 1. All flight crew must undergo monthly bias awareness training. 2. The check-in and in-flight seat verification system must now include both electronic and in-person confirmation from ground staff. 3. Any instance of discrimination, or inaction in the face of it, will trigger automatic disciplinary review. No exceptions. She paused. Her next words dropped like stone. And Carolyn Whitmore is to be terminated. Effective today. With cause. A slow exhale moved around the room. Like oxygen had been sucked out and only now was returning, cautiously. The CEO nodded once, slowly. Do we have a public response prepared? The head of communications, pale and visibly rattled, looked down at her tablet. Social media has already picked up pieces of the story. Someone filmed the FAA officers entering the aircraft. It's spreading under the hashtag Seat 2A. People are calling her the girl who grounded a flight. She hesitated. We can't spin this. The CEO leaned back, eyes dark. Then we don't spin. We surrender. Within 3 hours, an official statement was drafted and released. The tone was unlike any the company had ever used before. No cold corporate distancing. No vague regret. Just one clear admission: passenger Isla Morgan was removed unfairly. We failed her. We are changing. And somewhere, far from the cameras, far from the headlines, in a quiet federal office where glass walls overlooked an empty airstrip, Dr. Alina Jennings read the statement and said nothing. She simply closed her laptop, placed her pen down, and picked up a slim white folder labeled, Regulatory Amendment Proposal, the Morgan Clause. The contents weren't dramatic. A single-page draft. A new subsection for FAA flight policy. Clear protections for minors, particularly those traveling alone. Mandatory multi-level seat verification. Bias incident reporting protocols. But what mattered wasn't the wording. What mattered was the name at the top. From that day forward, Isla's name wouldn't just live in a flight log or incident report. It would live in policy. In training. In the systems people once believed were immutable. At a flight attendant training center in Atlanta, an instructor stood in front of a room of new recruits. On the screen behind him was a paused frame of internal cabin footage. Isla, standing quietly, backpack strap in hand, just before she had been removed. The instructor didn't lecture. He didn't need to. He pointed at the screen and said, "This is the reason we verify, not assume." In high school social studies classes across the country, teachers printed out summaries of what had happened on Flight 719. It became a case study in civic responsibility. The discussion prompt was simple: what would you have done if you sat next to Isla Morgan? And in one classroom in Seattle, a black freshman boy with a shy voice and a badge from the debate team on his hoodie raised his hand and said, "She didn't need to shout." That's why everyone had to listen. No one in the room interrupted. No one laughed. Because the silence, this time, was the right kind. Back at Isla's home, the sun dipped lower through the window. She sat curled on the couch, a warm mug of cocoa in her hands. Alina was at the kitchen table, reading messages on her phone. The world was still moving. The internet was buzzing. Some news anchor somewhere had just said Isla's name on live TV. But in this space, there was no noise. Only the hum of healing. Isla looked at Alina after a long pause and asked, "If you hadn't answered my message, what would have happened?" Alina didn't look up. "It's not that I answered," she said. "It's that you sent it." Isla nodded. Then whispered, "If I had to do it all again, I'd still sit in seat 2A. And she meant it. The name Carolyn Whitmore didn't vanish overnight. For a while, it lingered like the shadow of turbulence, trailing behind flight manifests and hallway conversations inside airports. She wasn't arrested. She wasn't dragged in front of cameras or smeared across magazine covers. There were no exposés, no viral videos showing her face in high resolution. But her name, just her name, became something else entirely. A warning. At every major flight attendant academy from Miami to Minneapolis, new trainees gathered in silent classrooms with sleek screens and ergonomic desks, ready to learn about customer care, emergency procedures, and professional conduct. And now, also this, bias response in high-pressure environments. On the first slide of the new training module, a single sentence, bold and sharp like a blade. Don't become another Carolyn. They didn't show her photo. They didn't need to. Those who had heard the story understood exactly what it meant. Because in the sterile quiet of those rooms, her name no longer stood for a person. It stood for a choice. A moment. A failure. And so the lesson began. An instructor walked to the center of the classroom, clicked a button on the remote, and played a muted clip. A girl young, black, in a hoodie being told to move from her seat. Then, that same girl walking back into frame, later, returning to the exact same spot. The class watched in silence. The clip ended. No music. No narration. Just raw images of discomfort. Then the instructor spoke. Not angrily. Not dramatically. Just factually. She had a ticket. She was right. But she was told she didn't belong, because someone trusted their instinct more than the protocol. He paused. And no one said anything. He looked around the room. That's why we say it. Don't become another Carolyn. Far from the screens and the training rooms, Carolyn Whitmore sat alone on a bench tucked behind a small regional airport near the Oregon coast. No more uniform. No red scarf. Her hair was loose now, wind-tousled. In her lap, a paperback she wasn't really reading. The sounds of propeller planes came and went above her like reminders of a life that felt so recent and so far away all at once. She hadn't applied for another airline position. She knew better. Her file was marked. Quietly. Permanently. Industry professionals had a name for it, graylisting. No public announcement. No headline. But every time her resume crossed a desk, it was met with silence. And this time, that silence wasn't hers to impose. She thought about Isla. Often. Not as a villain might think of a nemesis, but as a mirror thinks of the face it once reflected. She remembered the way Isla had looked at her, not with fury, not with tears, but with that unbearable calm. A calm that left no room for defense, no space to hide. It hadn't been the words Isla said. It had been the ones she didn't need to. Every now and then, Carolyn picked up her phone and typed out a message. To Isla. To Alina Jennings. To Transairs Ethics Board. She never pressed send. Because every version of the message sounded like an excuse. And what she was learning slowly, painfully, was that silence after harm doesn't fix anything. It just delays the weight of accountability. In another part of the country, in a clean, quiet high school classroom, Isla Morgan sat near a window with her head tilted toward the soft light. She wasn't on a stage. She wasn't giving a speech. Just listening to her sociology teacher read aloud an excerpt from the new FAA procedural update, the Morgan Clause. Across the room, her classmates sat quietly, some scribbling notes, some just watching her. When the teacher finished, she turned and asked, Isla, would you like to share anything? There was a pause. Then Isla shook her head gently. No, she said. I think the policy says enough. And it did. Because there it was, in black ink, protection. Recognition. A safeguard built not from outrage, but from one small act of courage, one message, quietly sent, from seat 22F. She didn't need applause. She didn't want to be famous. She just wanted what had happened to matter. And now, it did. On a chilly evening just a few weeks later, Dr. Alina Jennings stood behind a podium at the National Aviation Symposium in Washington, D.C. The room was filled with officials, executives, lawyers, educators, and young trainees who had just entered the world of flight. No lights flashed. No fanfare played. On the podium rested a simple framed photo. Isla, in seat 2A, hands folded in her lap, eyes toward the window. Alina didn't speak for the first few seconds. She just let the room look at the photo. Then she said, "This is what the moment looked like." A 16-year-old girl sitting in a place she had earned, being told she didn't belong. She looked up. And this, she gestured to the crowd, is what it became. A policy. A standard. A memory etched into our systems. So it won't happen again. She ended her remarks with a sentence that would later appear in classrooms, on safety manuals, and inside FAA reports. Not all turbulence comes from weather. Sometimes it comes from the choices we make when no one's watching. And somewhere far from the spotlight, in her room at home, Isla sat at her desk, headphones on, sketching atoms into the margin of her science notes. Her phone buzzed once. A message from a classmate. Just 2 words. "Thank you." She smiled. Not broadly. Just enough. Then she turned the page, and kept going. It wasn't fame that followed Isla Morgan. It wasn't headlines or interviews or morning show segments. She had declined them all. Not because she was afraid, and not because she didn't care. But because she understood something that many people still hadn't. Her story wasn't about being seen. It was about no longer being invisible. Still, her name moved. Quietly. Powerfully. Through teacher lounges where educators discussed equity in school policies. Through airport staff briefings where supervisors repeated her name with new urgency. Through internal memos at airlines with subject lines like, "Mandatory Review, Passenger Bias Protocols, Ref Isla Morgan." Her name had entered the bloodstream of the system, not as a scandal, but as a standard. At Transair's operations headquarters, inside a sleek glass building reflecting the Denver skyline, a new internal training portal went live. The welcome screen was simple. No logo. No slogan. Just a single line of text beneath a still image of a girl sitting calmly in seat 2A, staring out a plane window. Bias is not always loud. Sometimes, it's just a look. Underneath, in smaller letters, Module 1, Recognizing Silent Displacement. The program wasn't optional. Every employee, from the CEO to part-time baggage handlers, was required to complete the new training. Videos. Written tests. Role-play scenarios. And one consistent refrain at the end of each module: what would you have done if you had been there? That question now lived in people's minds long after the screen turned dark. A few states away, at an education policy conference in New York, a high school principal stepped up to a panel discussion on youth leadership. Her opening line didn't cite a textbook or quote a famous figure. She said, "A 16-year-old changed federal aviation policy without yelling, without protesting, without breaking anything. She simply refused to accept less than what she deserved." Her name is Isla Morgan. In the front row, a student council president scribbled the name down. No one told him to. He just felt like he should remember it. Back in her quiet neighborhood, on a morning that looked like any other, Isla walked the halls of her school. No security guards whispered. No kid stared anymore. Most days, she was just Isla again, the girl who liked chemistry, who tutored in the library during lunch, who wore sneakers with stars on the sides and never raised her hand unless she really had something to say. But the teachers saw her differently now. Not as a symbol, not as someone special, but as someone whose presence had changed their perspective. They double-checked when assigning group projects. They listened more carefully when a student asked, "Do I belong here?" They noticed the quiet ones. One afternoon, a younger student stopped her in the hall, a girl she didn't know, short, with frizzy hair and nervous fingers tapping a binder. "You're the one from the plane, right?" Isla paused. She wasn't used to being recognized here anymore. She nodded. The girl hesitated, then said, "I just wanted to say. I used to think being quiet meant people wouldn't hear me. But I saw what you did. And now I know it can mean something else. She didn't wait for a reply. She just walked off, her footsteps a little straighter than before. Isla didn't follow. She didn't call out. But she stood still for a moment, her hand resting lightly on her locker, feeling the weight of that small exchange settle into her chest like a warm stone. It didn't feel heavy. It felt whole. In a staff room 3 time zones away, a veteran flight attendant sat at a table, her meal half finished, her tablet open to the latest FAA memo. She was in her 50s, had flown for decades, seen everything from engine fires to proposals in midair. But the update she read now gave her pause. All crew are reminded, no passenger is to be removed from a verified seat without documentation and cross-verification. This includes minors. This includes everyone. She closed the memo. Leaned back. Exhaled. Then she said aloud, mostly to herself, she was just a kid. The young attendant beside her, fresh from training, looked up. Who? The older woman didn't answer right away. She sipped her coffee, then said softly, "You'll hear her name. Isla Morgan. Don't forget it. And if you're ever in her seat or near it, do better than we did." The young attendant nodded slowly. And that was all. Back in her room, on a late evening lit only by a small desk lamp, Isla sat at her desk with her science textbook open but untouched. Her mind wasn't on ions or molecules tonight. It was elsewhere. Her phone buzzed once. A message from Alina. Just 2 words, "Well done." Isla didn't type anything back. She didn't need to. She looked over at her backpack, the same faded one she had carried onto Flight 719. It was now propped neatly in the corner, its fabric slightly worn, its zipper smooth from use. She hadn't thrown it away. She never would. Not because it had changed anything. But because it had been there. With her. In that seat. In that moment. And sometimes, that's enough. She leaned back in her chair, let the silence settle in again, and thought, I didn't change the world. I just stopped it from pretending. It had been 3 months. 3 quiet months. No press, no new memos, no hearings or hashtags trending overnight. Just time passing slowly but intentionally, like air finally learning how to breathe again. The world hadn't changed. Not all of it. Not yet. But in some places, at gates and terminals, in classrooms and cabins, in the quiet space between reaction and assumption, something had shifted. People looked twice now. They asked instead of assuming. Checked before correcting. Thought before moving someone, just to be sure. And that was enough for now. In the lobby of the Federal Aviation Administration's East Wing, a new display had been quietly installed. It wasn't grand or glittering. No plaque of gold, no ribbon to cut. Just a shadowbox frame beside the entrance to the training auditorium. Inside it, a faded boarding pass, laminated behind glass. The seat, 2A. The flight, 719. Below it, a small engraved plate read. Seat verified, in honor of Isla Morgan, who reminded us that silence can be a voice, and presence is a right. FAA Compliance Update 143A, the Morgan Clause, enacted June 1. Some people walked past it every day without noticing. But others, those who knew, paused. They didn't take photos. They didn't speak. They just stood still, as if listening to the moment that boarding pass had once carried. And in that stillness, something sacred lingered. In a quiet cafe tucked between 2 bookstores on the campus of Briar Hill University, Isla sat at a window table with a pencil behind her ear and her physics notes spread in front of her. Outside, students passed by with earbuds in, lattes in hand, chasing deadlines. Inside, time slowed around her. She hadn't come here to be known. She hadn't come to prove anything. She'd come because she loved to learn, and now no one questioned if she belonged. The barista, a senior named Marcus, set her cup down and smiled. "Hey," he said softly, "I heard someone in the FAA wrote a clause with your name on it." Isla looked up, slightly surprised. "You heard that?" He shrugged. "Someone sent it in the group chat. Pretty badass." She didn't laugh. She didn't deny it. Just said, "It's just a name on paper." Marcus tilted his head. "Maybe. But it changed the way I think about stuff." He walked off. And Isla sat there, the cup warm in her hands, the hum of conversation swirling gently around her, and she realized this was what justice looked like. Not applause. But ease. The ease of knowing that you don't have to keep your head down. That you don't have to shrink. That you don't have to keep your ticket clutched in your hand like proof of your worth. You just sit. In your seat. As yourself. And no one dares question it. At Gate 4 of a busy regional airport, a girl no older than 15 stood nervously at the front of the boarding line, clutching a well-worn backpack and a phone in her hand. She was flying alone. First time. Her boarding pass said 1A, but she still felt like maybe someone would stop her. Ask her something. Make her prove it. But when the gate agent scanned her pass and smiled, "Welcome aboard," she blinked. That was it. On the plane, a young flight attendant glanced at her seat, then back at the list. He nodded. "Seat 1A?" he asked gently. She nodded. "Verified," he said, smiling. "Welcome. Let me know if you need anything." She settled in, cautiously. Then exhaled. And somewhere, in the trace memory of the cabin, in the quiet that came after takeoff, in the sound of seatbelts clicking and books opening and earbuds slipping, in Isla's story lived. Not in shouting. Not in spectacle. But in every moment someone sat down and wasn't questioned. In every moment a seat was seen as more than a number. In every moment justice meant nothing more and nothing less than letting someone stay where they were always meant to be. Isla Morgan didn't raise her voice. She didn't make a scene. She simply stayed in the seat she had earned and reminded the world that dignity doesn't need permission. Because sometimes, the strongest revolutions begin with silence. If this story moved you, share it. Let others see that even in the smallest moments, justice matters. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories that reveal the truth, challenge prejudice, and inspire change. Because the next seat someone tries to take, might be yours.